Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the media, one of my favorite topics. We're going to talk to Fred Exoo. He's a professor of government at St. Lawrence University and the author of The Pen and the Sword, Press, War, and Terror in the 21st Century. Professor Exoo, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Pleasure's all mine.
All right, now let's get to it. The war in Afghanistan, you say there are two sides of the story, but the press only told one of them. Why is that, and what do you mean?
Well, the press has consistently, in our 21st century wars, told a pro-war story. And as to why, we might set a little bit of historical context here and just say that something pretty fundamental in our press system has changed since Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, the press was not a leader of the anti-war movement, certainly. It was a laggard, but it did eventually come around. In other words, after most of the public and a good chunk of elite Washington began to oppose the Vietnam War, the press finally began, pieces and elements of it did, to oppose the war as well. Now, if we fast forward to the 21st century, that didn't happen. In other words, somewhere around 2005, 2006, the public begins to turn against the war. Then members of Congress begin to turn against the war. And despite all of that, the press clings fast to an increasingly untenable and unbelievable story, a pro-war story. So something, as I say, fundamental has changed. And then we could get to the question of why, if you want to pursue that.
Yeah, I certainly do want to pursue that. But first, before we do, real quick, why do you say that, though? I mean, how clear is the evidence on that, that they did not turn as quickly as the American people, et cetera?
Well, I mean, we might just consider the current situation. And if we consider the fact, on the one hand, that as of November of this year, 53 or 57% of Americans opposed our involvement in Afghanistan, depending on which poll you're looking at. So that's a majority of Americans, a simple majority of Americans opposing that conflict. And yet, in the first 9 months of 2009, the New York Times editorialized at a 5-to-1 ratio in favor of war. In other words, there were 5 times as many editorials in favor of war and in favor of the surges as there were opposing it. The Washington Post, another supposedly liberal paper, plumped for war at a rate of 10-to-1. In other words, 10 editorials in favor of war and in favor of surges for every one that opposed it.
So then let's get to why you think that's the case. What happened in the media that they seem to be so much more to the right of the country, especially in regards to these wars?
Well, in the book I've argued that there were 3 central forces pushing the media in a rightward direction and in a pro-war direction between the time of Vietnam and the present. And that those 3 things were, number one, a commercial imperative. It's always been there in our very, very commercial media. But that imperative, the screws of that imperative have tightened, especially in the last couple of decades, and even more so in the 21st century. A second basic element would be the increasing power of elite sources to define the news. The number of levers that they can pull to make the news the way they want it has increased considerably. And number 3, the power of a right-wing media empire that has been planted and grown up and is in full bloom since the late 1960s. And I think those are probably the 3 main forces that have made war the default position for our mass media today.
Let me run my favorite theory by you on that, and that's part of what you were talking about there, which is that, look, in the old days, the press would attack the government in 800 different ways, because there was sometimes partisan press, so there'd be somebody attacking from one side at least. The other thing is they wanted to be a little sensational, so they sold papers. Now, you would think that those forces are still active here, so it should be in effect, but it's not for the mainstream news outlets. And so my theory is that what's changed is that those outlets are connected to larger and larger corporations whose interest is in in not pissing off the government, to put it in politely. Okay.
Sure.
And so they think, yeah, I might sell more papers, or in this case, have more people watch me if I do. But you know what? It'll harm my other corporate interests, so I don't want to rock that boat. What do you think about that theory?
That's absolutely one of the things that's going on. For example, Walter Isaacson, who was the head of CNN at the time of the Iraq War, Isaacson has said publicly that he got phone calls from major advertisers and from large corporations telling him that they thought his stories were unpatriotic if they had stories about civilian casualties. And it was really after those phone calls, Isaacson said, that he issued his famous memo telling his CNN reporters that any time they mentioned civilian casualties, they had to remind Americans of the reason for these civilian casualties. They had to mention 9/11.
Which, by the way, was not the reason for the civilian casualties.
Well, right.
I mean, I love how he states that as if it's an excuse or a justification when it makes it almost 100 times worse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because then he's propagating a lie by the government even more so. You know, I have a friend who works in the industry, and he said, look, CNN actually cares a lot about its advertisers, but it also cares a lot about the subscriptions that it gets from cable, because it's on cable, the money that they get from that. So even if they're going to do vanilla programming, even if they're not going to challenge the government, even if they get bad ratings because they're not challenging the government, whether it's the Republican or a Democratic government, they don't really mind that much because mainly they want to protect the brand so they can keep getting money from those subscriptions, not only in the United States, but all over the world. That's another interesting theory. Do you think that might be part of the calculus?
I do, Cenk, and you know, there's really a whole host of commercial imperatives moving the news in the same direction. One of the things that's going on, for example, it seems clear, is that there is a rally around the flag effect anytime war is in the air in this country. And that redounds to the benefit of the president. So Americans kind of rally around the president anytime war is in the air. And that means that as a network, you imperil yourself commercially if you criticize that president too harshly. And our mass media just didn't have the courage to surmount that particular imperative.
Well, it's definitely an interesting book, Professor Fred Exoo. The book is The Pen and the Sword, Press, War, and Terror in the 21st Century. Thank you so much for joining us on The Young Turks.
Oh, again, my pleasure, Cenk. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We'll be right back.